Hey, greetings everyone, it's GleeCon, and I am here once again, bringing you another episode of Lore of Warcraft. And just like always, I am completely overjoyed to be here, totally happy, and I am happy that you're tuning in too. So on the last episode, we kind of had a a little bit boring, especially from a content production side, also probably from the viewing side, and I apologize for that. Hopefully it gets minimized as much as possible, but we had a carry. Is all I could get for an Alliance Shadowfang keep run at level, and we just had like a OP fully bedecked, almost straight best in slot paladin carry me and one other person through and pulled the whole dungeon in like 3 pulls or something. It was pretty, impressive from that side. I don't think we've ever seen something quite so dope. He was definitely geared up to where the mobs couldn't even hurt him. A lot different from like a mage carry that you might see. Got a couple little side grades, and then we're ready to start. We're going to kick off Stone Talon tomorrow. Like I said, we've only got a couple more records that are going to go out before a hiatus, summer vacation, summer of GleeCon. But I wanted to get this one in. So I had mentioned we've been doing the art. We've done World of Warcraft, the art of World of Warcraft, and specifically the art of the cinematic art of Wrath of Lich King lately. And originally, when I did my run, I was trying to really stick to canon stuff and things that were more definitely like books and things that were official. And for some reason, there's this book series here called the World of Warcraft Folk and Fairytales of Azeroth, but it's got tagged as non-canon. I don't know why. If you look at the people writing it, Garth Nix, Christy Golden, I feel like maybe this is Alyssa Wong. There's half the people in there are people we've read books of, and the other half, I'm sure, this is blessed by Blizzard. So the only reason why I can think it's maybe not canon is because they're fairy tales. So they might not be historically accurate. So I'm going to read them. They're sprinkled. This book, actually, I got this as a Christmas present and I haven't read it. So I've been waiting. I knew I was going to incorporate it into the show. Right around the same time I started the show is when I got this book. It came out in 2021. So I've been saving it this entire time. Literally never cracked it open until a day like today. Now, I also did change. If you notice, there's some wood grain in the background and stuff. I changed my process because it was such a long, painstaking. I've tried a new scanning process. It's not perfected yet, but this entire story it took me maybe 10 minutes to scan this in and get the setup for us like this, maybe less. Somewhere in the 5 to 15 minute range, so that's a lot better. But anyway, we're going to read one story today. When we get back from the trip, I'll read another one. So in a couple weeks. Because there are 2 I have lined up. Now, these 2 they're just considered, they could really happen anywhere in the timeline. There's nothing that's happened that really pins them down. Most likely they came after the Curse of Flesh. That's all we know because they seem to be fleshy creatures and not made of stone. So without further ado, stay a while and listen as we kick off Folk and Fairytales of Azeroth. It's a beautiful book too. I don't know if you can get a digital version. I just know I got this as a gift, so I'm going to make use of it. I'm not going to pay for a digital version as well. This is the Coloron, or whatever they call it, Colophon. Yeah, 2021. And each story has these little circles, and they change. So I don't know if each one is story specific. This is for the book itself. But I wonder if those change. So let's just kind of think like, we'll try to clock that. At 6 o'clock, there's a rapier. At 11, there's a gear. At 3 o'clock, there's coins. And, see, this is the only picture like this, but as I kind of tweaked it, and you can see my finger there, my fingers, that's the closest up you've seen these hands on this show. They kind of look weird all zoomed in. I'll try to cut that out in the future. I think I'll get better about that. But it was so bendy. I suspect there's a spark in each of us that wants to make believe. This is the introduction. We're going to read this as well, by the way, in this episode only. In childhood, we listened to bedtime stories or daydreamed on rainy days. We played the hero, the villain, and even the dragon. It was very likely that same desire that first brought you and me to Azeroth, to the sprawling world of Warcraft. With the click of a button, we were transported to frozen citadels, deep-sea empires, and cursed lands. Here, we once again charted our own paths, learned the weight of horror and heroism, overcame conflict, and forged fast friendships. We discovered that our love of stories and desire to play make-believe are unbound by age. We also found that World of Warcraft has its own stories to tell. I'm not referring to the Burning Legion, or the Lich King, or the machinations of the old gods. We've been a part of these massive sagas, yes, but what humble fireside adventures are we missing? The cautionary tales hollered at naughty children, the triumphant yarns spun between soldiers rallying for a fight, the romances used to soothe aching hearts yearning for connection, stories that grow in the telling, shared before inn hearths from Kalimdor to the Eastern Kingdoms and the lands beyond. In short, how did the common folk of Azeroth play the dragon? What follows is our attempt to bottle that essence with stories supported by the World of Warcraft team and told by some of modern fantasy's brightest stars. Together we spent many hours researching established legends within the Warcraft mythos, including the people and places we thought deserved more attention, alongside harebrained ideas that ended up working far better than we could have hoped. After all, who doesn't want to know about the goblin's boogeyman? Real-world myths and fairy tale tropes lent their collective hands for inspiration, and many pots of tea fueled brainstorms, late-night revisions, and fascinating conversations. The tales you're about to read take these notions and realize them as living, breathing legends, grounded in the many cultures of Azeroth, but also stretching into unexplored corners. Using direction from myself, the Warcraft team, and our lore masters as a guide. Oh, rip lore masters. The authors were free to explore Azeroth through their own vision. As such, some of the tales you'll encounter here may be rooted in canon, or they may be another traveler just telling a tall tale. Every good fairy tale conveys a simple truth or moral lesson, and you'll find that these stories are no exception. Though the tales captured here were written with adult readers in mind, many can be enjoyed by those young and old, longtime fans of Warcraft or those in search of exciting new fantasy. The writers and artists who brought this collection to life represent the diverse Warcraft playership we at Blizzard know and love, and we couldn't be more thrilled to share their creations with you. After all, no universe can be known by hearing just one voice or be told by just one tale. So settle in, lay down your armor, and sheathe your swords. Try reading some of the stories aloud if you like. Let's do it. Step into Azeroth's own fairy tales and play the dragon with us. Allison Irons, the editor, never heard of her. So we're going to read Lay Down My Bones today. It's by Allison Wong and illustrated by Lindsay Burkar. Some little trees with leaves. And we do have rapier at 6, coins at 3, gear at 11. So I guess it's the same picture throughout. Interesting little motif there. And here we have a bone. So this story is maybe tied to the bone, and you have little fossils. The night I stole the wailing bone, I waited until the rest of the caravan was asleep, lying in my bedroll and pretending not to hear the steady drip, drip, drip of water on the wagon canvas. My parents snored at one end of the wagon, their whiskers fluttering with every breath. They slept with their backs turned to each other, their large soft tails curled angrily away, pulled tight against their bodies. They'd fought again, just like they had every night for the past few weeks. I slid free of my blanket and crept past my pile of sleeping younger siblings, careful not to wake them. There were 5 of them, all still kits, with giant paws and oversized pointed ears. Looking at them made my heart hurt. As the eldest, just a year shy of adulthood, I spent much of my time watching over them. Even now in the dark, they looked exhausted. No one had slept well in ages, not with the constant sound of dripping water in our ears. When I parted the linen flaps and gazed up at the sky, it was clear and bright with stars. The desert sand beneath the wagon was dry. Drip, drip, drip. My ears twitched. The wet, persistent sound followed me to Elder Coolin's wagon, which rested at the head of the caravan. It was easy to quietly undo one of the heavy side flaps, now more patchwork than hide, and even easier to slip inside. As Elder Coolin shifted listlessly in her sleep, I padded toward the carved wooden trunk along the far wall. Most objects in the caravan had multiple functions, shifting easily between uses. This trunk was a rare exception, crafted for only one purpose. Gently, slowly, I lifted the lid. There, nestled in a bed of gauzy fabric, lay the wailing bone. Our caravan's only heirloom, older than the oldest wagon. It was the length of my forearm, as thick around as my wrist. Its surface was carved with an ancient poem, written in a script that few vulpera could read, but all could recite by heart. Wander, roam, bring me home, down paths at my behest. Among the stones lay down my bones, so I, at last, may rest. As I looked at the wailing bone, my stomach twisted. Not even the dark could hide the fact that the wailing bone had been snapped in half. The two halves had been pushed together, but there was an ugly, jagged crack between them. Elder Kulin snorted and I froze, my paws hovering over the wooden chest, but she rolled over, lightly snoring, and I was able to breathe again. I leaned in and, after a moment's hesitation, touched the bone. The gentle, persistent dripping was gone, and suddenly I was being sucked under a river's surface. The breath ripped from my lungs. My head was filled with the roar of rushing water. My throat closed up. I fought to breathe, choking on nothing. I felt as though clawed hands gripped my shoulders from behind, and a phantom voice snarled in my ear, "No rest! Never rest!" I managed to yank my paw away. The moment I did, the chilling grasp vanished and the roaring sound was gone. In its place was the soft drip, drip, drip that had followed the caravan for the past month. I shuddered. Clearly handling the bone was a bad idea, but tonight was already full of bad ideas. What was one more? I carefully avoided touching the wailing bone again as I rolled its halves up in their gauzy cloth. I shoved the parcel down my shirt and slid back out of the wagon. From there, I snuck a riding hyena, my hyena, Isha, and her tack out of the dens, and together we loped across the sands, out into the wilderness of Vol'dun. The dripping sound continued to echo in my ears even as the caravans grew small in the distance. Beneath my shirt, the wailing bone knocked against my ribs like a warning. Okay, so here we have a pause. And I would also say, perhaps, since this place is called Vol'dun, we could look into. To me, I would imagine that this is happening after the Sundering, which is still fine. It's within our lifeline or whatever here, but I don't know. We have no reference to that, but we don't. I would imagine Vol'dun is something that appeared as part of the Zandalari Isles. No one believed in the wailing bone. Not really. It was a silly tale told to kids, the kind of tradition that adults played along with to make the caravan elders feel important. Elder Rivu was the first to tell me the story of the wailing bone back when I was little. The first vulpera was born from the desert's magic, he said, crouched before the campfire with all the young ones gathered close. Rivu's story times were a highlight of a childhood spent on the road. Sometimes he would even do shadow puppets with his claws. Our people roam all our lives, but when we die, the desert calls our bodies back to where we began. To help our spirits find the end of their journey beyond the veil, we follow the wailing bone. Follow it where? My favorite cousin, Sai, piped up. He was 2 years older than me, already starting to grow gangly, while I remained as short as a barrel cactus. We would wrestle and laugh and play as often as we could. Sai was clever and mischievous in a way that I aspired to be, and I was glued to his side like a shadow. Rivu smiled kindly. He had led the caravan for decades, guiding us safely through the Vol'dun desert. We go wherever the wailing bone guides us, Sai. Sometimes the journey takes a day, sometimes it might take weeks. The journey is hard and takes great patience, but when the wailing bone begins to cry, we know we found our loved one's final resting place. Someday it will be your turn to hold the wailing bone and send my spirit home. What if the bone doesn't cry? I asked quietly. Both Rivu and Sai glanced at me. I didn't speak up often, but this time I raised my voice. Do we have to wander forever? I hope not, Hava, Rivu replied amused. The campfire cast rippling light across the sand, reflecting in his bright eyes. Forever is a very long time. You're late, Sai hissed. My cousin waited for me at the edge of the canyon, gripping the reins of his hyena. His paranoid gaze darted past me as if he expected to see the rest of our caravan hot on my heels. There were dark circles under his eyes, and his golden fur was ragged. Sai was usually vain about his fur, but he looked like he'd gone tracking prey across the dunes for a week and had forgotten to bring a comb. To be fair, I knew I didn't look much better. Lack of sleep made me feel slow and stupid. If you're so pressed for time, maybe you should have stolen the wailing bone, I snapped, hopping off Isha's back. The sand underfoot was cool. At night, the desert heat gave way to cold stone and dry winds. It was the best time to travel when speed mattered more than safety. Sai approached. Did you get it? He asked in a low voice. I pulled out the cloth-wrapped package. Sai seized the wailing bone and began to tear at the cloth. Sai, wait, I said, trying to grab his arm, but he shook me off. Sai, don't touch it, it's... The moment Sai grabbed the wailing bone, his eyes flew open. A strangled scream left his mouth, but it sounded wrong, garbled, like he was howling underwater. His body froze up, claws curved in a rictus around the bone. I tried to shake him, but he didn't move. There was no time to think. I slammed into Sai with my shoulder, knocking us both to the sand. The wailing bone flew past us, its two broken ends bouncing in opposite directions. Sai gasped for breath, rolling over on his stomach. He struggled to his hands and knees and vomited a torrent of water onto the ground. It was more water than I'd ever seen Sai drink in one sitting or even a day. It poured out of him like a river, studded with little pebbles and silt. Finally, with one last heave, the water ran dry. There were a handful of tiny silver fish, minnows, flopping in the mud between his front paws. That's weird. And also, here's a little, for some reason they've given us like a magazine style. The journey is hard and takes great patience, but when the wailing bone begins to cry, we know we found our loved one's final resting place. For some reason, that's our pull quote. Sai was still choking. There was something hanging from his mouth, limp and corded. I grasped and pulled, and length after length of slimy fibers emerged from his throat. It was river grass, enough to circle my waist several times over. Fresh and wet, still vibrant green, ending in stringy, spidery roots. Sai looked at me with terror in his eyes. I told you not to touch it, I said shakily. I got to my feet and gathered the pieces of the wailing bone, trying to ignore the strange, awful sound of dripping water all around me. A sound with no source. The sound that had followed Sai and me home 3 weeks ago and never left. Drip. 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 We have to make the dripping stop tonight, Sai said. His voice was hoarse. He spat on the ground and another pebble clattered out to join the others. I can't keep living like this, Hava. It's going to kill me. I can barely sleep, and when I do, I have nightmares. I did too. I heard that dripping sound all hours of the day and night, wearing away at my nerves like a stream, carving an indent in a cliff. I even heard it in my sleep. When I dreamed of water, rising up around my ears, pouring down my throat until I choked and drowned. I dreamed of Elder Rivu, his corpse soft and river-rotted, howling my name as he chased me through the desert. In those dreams, Sai ran at my side until his paws bled, gasping for air. Every morning I woke, more exhausted than the day before. As much as I hated to admit it, Sai was right. I used my claws to cut the soft, gauzy cloth in 2 strips. I wrapped one fragment of the wailing bone in it, covering the jagged part and creating a makeshift handle. I held it out to Sai, who stared at it like I was handing him a live snake. To be fair, this was worse. Take it, I said impatiently. He wrapped his fingers tentatively around the bone encased in the thinnest armor in the desert. We both held our breath. Slowly, Sai shook his head. Nothing. No water, no drowning, no voices. The tightness in my chest loosened just a bit. I quickly wrapped the other half of the wailing bone, holding it tightly. Its jagged, broken edge bit into my palm through the fabric. Together, Sai and I turned to face the canyon up ahead. It cut a giant gash into the desert, an open wound in the face of the rock. Somewhere in there, a river wound through the rocks like the crooked tail of a scorpion, glistening beneath the moon, still swollen from the spring rains. We left the hyenas behind and began our descent, picking a path down to the canyon's throat. As Sai followed me, the wailing bone in my hand began to shiver. Elder Revu had been right about one thing, and here's a picture of like a spirit vulpera coming out of us. The bone. Spooky. Oh, and there's the two vulpera kids freaking out. When he'd passed away, the caravan had entrusted Sai and me with the wailing bone. Since Revu had no kin, and we were on the cusp of adulthood, we had been tasked with carrying the bone at the head of the caravan. We perched on the driver's seat of Revu's wagon and traded off wailing bone duty, pointing it out toward the desert and slowly moving it back and forth, ears cocked for the slightest hint of a sound. At first it was exciting. It was our first time seeing the wailing bone outside its shroud, and the responsibility made me feel important. But no matter where or how far our caravan roamed, the bone refused to cry. Everyone was exhausted and impatient, including Sai and me, our arms achy from holding them outstretched for weeks. Elder Revu's body lay behind us in his wagon, wrapped in an oiled canvas sheet with desert flowers and herbs, slowly decomposing in the blistering heat. The smell was awful, try as the plants might to dispel it. When a flash flood struck, sweeping through the dry, cracked land, I half hoped it would sweep Reva's wagon away too. No such luck. Our wagons were sturdy and cunningly made, able to withstand the torrent of water. I'd never resented them more. When I voiced my complaints to Sai, he narrowed his eyes in consideration. "There is a canyon not far from here," he said. "The riverbed's usually dry, but the flash flood will have filled it up. If we put Revu's body in the river, the current will do our job for us. It'll probably carry him to his final resting place, and no one will be the wiser." I glanced back at the closed wagon flap, dread and hope building in my chest. "The bone will know." "Will it?" Sai countered. "It's a bone. We don't even know if it works." I must not have looked convinced, because he drew himself up, his tufted ears pointed forward. His fluffy tail flicked arrogantly behind him. "Look, Hava, even if the river can't take him to the right spot, it'll still carry his body downstream every rain. It'll trick the wailing bone into thinking he's still wandering with the caravan, searching for his resting place. Trust me, it's brilliant." Of course I trusted him. Clever Sai was always right, even when he wasn't. I had my doubts about his plan, but I was so tired of wandering the desert. I just wanted to be done. I'd spent my whole life following Sai, so I followed him into the canyon that night, with Elder Revu's body strapped to my saddle. Only the stars witnessed us haul him over the river's edge and throw him over. But the moment Elder Revu's body hit the water, the wailing bone screamed. This was no low, wrenching sob. It was a horrible, piercing sound that tore through me, standing my fur on end. Sai and I turned just in time to see the wailing bone crack in half. Our caravan's precious heirloom lay in two pieces on the riverbank, its halves aimed at us like accusatory fingers. The rest of that night was a blur. I remember scrambling back to the caravan, telling my parents that we'd followed the wailing bone to Elder Revu's resting place on our own, that we'd buried him out among the bluffs. Sai made a big show of explaining how we'd done it for the good of our kin, seeing how tired they all were from our long journey. I remember wrapping the broken wailing bone up tightly and stuffing it back into its trunk. The rest of the caravan sighed with relief, and we all laid down for a well-deserved rest. But the quiet comfort of night would be lost to us when the slow, malevolent sound of dripping water began. No one could find its source or make it stop. Only Sai and I knew that our crime had followed us home. Tonight things would be different. Tonight we were going to fix everything. I stared at the back of Sai's head as we followed the familiar path into the canyon. I was so tired that it was hard to focus. I gritted my teeth and kept my eyes on my cousin. The canyon's red sandstone walls rose up around us as we approached the river's edge. Another flash flood had washed through the canyon recently, and the water level was still high. I lifted the tip of my wailing bone fragment and pointed it at the water. Did you feel that, Sai? He glanced at me, one ear swiveling back. What? The bone hummed when we got near the water. I stepped closer to the river, just short of the shoreline. Even from here, the current looked deadly fast. Was it fast enough to rip an abandoned body from the riverbed and wash it downstream? Come here and listen. Sai came to join me, waving his piece of the wailing bone slowly over the river like a dowsing rod. I don't hear anything, he said, gazing out toward the rocks on the other side. I don't think my half of the wailing bone is making any noise. Of course it wasn't. Neither was mine. I gripped my side of the wailing bone with both paws and stepped up behind him, out of his line of sight. Then I swung as hard as I could. The wailing bone smashed into Sai's head with an ugly crunch. He crumpled to the ground, gasping. I stood over my cousin, gazing down at his face. My closest friend. The one who had come up with the plan to throw Elder Revu in the river, and in doing so, had cursed us all. Ava, Sai gasped. Don't, I said shakily. I raised the bone and slammed it down again. Sai was bigger than me, but by the time I was done, he couldn't move. He couldn't even fight as I grabbed him under the arms and dragged him into the river. He did fight me when I pushed him beneath the surface, his bloodied claws scrabbling at my wrists. But I pressed the wailing bone against his throat and shoved him deeper into the water. My arms burned and tears poured down my face, but I held on. It felt like forever until the frantic bubbles stopped and Sai went quiet. When I let go, Sai's body should have floated. Instead, it sank quietly into the water, his blank eyes staring up at me until they disappeared into the depths. I stood panting, waist deep in the river, trying not to cry, throw up. I held both ends of the quiet wailing bone, one in each hand. For the first time in ages, I didn't hear the dripping sound. And even more powerful than the guilt and horror in my heart was my utter sense of relief. There! I screamed. Are you satisfied? Are you satisfied? It was all his idea. Take him and leave us alone. For a moment, there was silence. And then the wailing bone laughed. Claws grabbed my ankles and yanked me off my feet. I plunged beneath the surface of the water, flailing. Something else caught my wrist, and a pale, wizened face pushed into my vision. Elder Revu, bloated from 3 weeks underwater, bared his teeth at me. I tried to scream, but all I got was a mouthful of water. The halves of the wailing bone burned in my paws. For generations, your caravan has given themselves to me. I could hear its voice in my head, clear as the air after a rainstorm. It was the same one I'd heard when I'd lifted it from the trunk mere hours. And yet, a lifetime ago, they performed their duty. I know how burdensome it is. In return, I granted their spirits peace. I found their journey's end. Thousands of vulpera followed my cries, but you abandoned your elder and left him in this river where his body can never know rest, fighting alone against the current. Another set of fingers grasped my leg and Sai's shattered body clawed at me. They were pulling me deeper into the river. I tried to fight them, but they were impossibly strong. My lungs burned as I struggled. I was running out of air, growing weaker. This isn't where I'm supposed to die, I thought wildly, staring down at my cousin's broken face. His eyes were vacant. Isn't it? I already cried for you that first night, the wailing bone whispered. I saw myself with Sai pushing Elder Revu into the water as the wailing bone screamed. And now you've followed me here to rest. Together, Revu and Sai dragged me down, down, down into the river until the water went cold and the last of the stars winked out. But you've heard this story 1,000 times, haven't you? The two naughty kits neglected their duty and broke the wailing bone and the curse that haunted them until they died. Here's the part your parents won't tell you. A year after I died, my bones washed ashore at the mouth of the canyon. My parents discovered them and took them back to the caravan. They brought back Sai's, too. As many of them as they could find. His had been eroded and tumbled to pieces against the rocks. They took me to Elder Coolin, and she carved that familiar, horrible poem into my surface. Now, when someone dies, I lead the caravan across the sands. I can feel the pull of the desert, and I cry and sob and scream. No one hears me until we reach the place where the dead can rest. But I can hear everything. I hear how tired you are of traveling with your grandmother's body. It's been weeks of wandering with no end in sight, and the caravan is getting restless. You haven't felt me stir in your paws at all. I've heard the frustration in your voice as you wonder how much longer this will take. And I've heard you talking with Enya about how easy it would be to hide your grandmother in a shallow grave beneath the bluffs. It would be easy, but I would take care if I were you. If you're going to act a fool, remember, shirking your duty always has consequences. And the caravan always needs a wailing bone. All right, so that is our first fable. Not the first one in the book, but the first one that we're reading since we're doing them sort of chronologically. Although that one really could have fallen anywhere. Well, I did not expect it to be so morbid and dark. Like, just get us right into murder, like almost like a ghost story. Like, you know what this reminds me of? The level of horror. It's where it said, you know, you could read these to your kids or whatever. If you remember the old scary stories books that you could read in like middle school, elementary school. And the memories that those books would impart in you, them things were scary. And as an adult, if I've gone back and read some of them when I had kids, and I'm like, oh, this is like, these are laughable. They're like basically like what we just read. But as a kid, man, that stuff boop, shakes you up. That shit shakes you up. So I guess we're gonna get some of that with this too. But end of the day, it's a fable. We have a moral. Shirking your duty has consequences. It does. As a matter of fact, everything in life has consequences. What you need to realize is consequences are not always good or bad, but there will always be a cause and effect. So, we have another episode in the pipe 5x5. I hope you enjoyed this interesting beginning to our journey through fables. I look forward to starting Stone Town with you tomorrow, but above all, more than anything else, I enjoyed my time with you this evening. And I'll see you guys next time on Lore of Warcraft.